plan on housing, and then we would have a debate about all the different points of view. And thank you for your perspective. Good afternoon. I say thank you to the invite to be here today. My presentation this afternoon has to do with housing and planning. Us in Guimarães, we are starting a public discussion next week. But I'm not going to present the plan that we're having. Here we're planning a few difficulties that we have and say a bit how the way that the planning integrates the housing on how the legislative part works with this, how that can bring us solutions and accompany the difficulties of the territory. This is not specifically a territorial presentation, but more of a reflection of what is around the juridical part. So the presentation is separated in 3 moments. The housing as a component of the structural and order of the territory. There are no places here that have no human presence, so everyone has to have housing at their hand. Second, challenges that we have nowadays when trying to make a plan for a territorial part. Usually the planning is a process that is long and that has a lot of stability in the territory, and what challenges are put in that situation. And third, there are answers to the difficulties when it comes to the court documents and the difficulties that come into the legislative part. And all this legislative part has suffered a lot of throughout these years because of how different the territories are. And us, for example, we're needing the revision of the plans, and it isn't always easy to articulate this kind of thing. It's very difficult to follow simply a guide because this poses a question when we take planning into consideration. Housing has a big, important role in when it comes to territories. And in Guimarães, like any other place, we have the center where you have the housing. It's not all the same. So we need to think of new areas where we can expand. But we also have to think of how we can rehabilitate the territory. How we can convert and rebuild things. How can we articulate the territory in a way that we take into consideration new services and new amenities? We also have to, instead of densify, do the exact opposite because we have way too much. And we need to find a way that those plans answer all the problems that we have. And it often raises a few challenges when it comes to the planning in a territorial level. So the different nature and places in each territory, they force us to take different approaches. So we cannot think about it in a linear way because it forces us to find new ways in function of a territory. On the other side of coin, we're in a time where you have a lot of challenges in when it comes to housing. There are new ways of having a house. There are new typologies of houses. And we just have to think about 20 or 30 years ago. We had families with 6, 7 people in the same house. And usually we have the nuclear families which are much smaller. So the typology of the houses that we built 20, 50 years ago are not the same. So you have the necessity of finding another type of typology because they no longer fit the needs of the current population. So this building forces us to find more flexibility when it comes to building. Those spaces have to be able to transform and shape themselves in order to actually fit the needs. So there are areas that point towards housing for familiar spaces. But we have to take in consideration that those spaces need bigger buildings and how this kind of planning limits the building of those flats. And so we need to adapt in order to fit this. We also have to take into consideration the inclusion and the discipline. We have to understand that some areas shouldn't have to just expel the people that already live there. So this points to a reality that is heavily changing. So we need a lot of flexibility in those territories, but it always forces us to understand what they actually need. So we cannot make a change that's too big because it can put into a lot of trouble something that already exists. There's another aspect that we have to talk about, which is what impact does the changing in need of housing has an impact in the infrastructures, how it impacts the ecosystem around housing, and how it changes mobility and accessibility. Housing, on one hand, is something that is planned and promoted, but we also have to take the consideration that territories have a certain amount of density that we can have because they're not infinite. But in this sense, it's necessary that we find a way to take care of the territories in a accessible and correct way. So housing is a factor that introduces, when we talk about territory, it adds the factors in the structure. Okay, now talking about the challenges that we have to talk about society and how there are characteristics that interfere when it comes to the process. The process is very long, and I would say that it has a lot of difficulty when reality ching- makes itself very notable. We have socioeconomics that are being way too fast, making it difficult and having crisis in the middle of the planning. We have a lot of pressure when it comes to real estate, which leads to many times us having difficulties with getting it through. We also have the necessity for new infrastructures and in public equipments. It has a lot of it makes a lot of pressure when it comes to systems of transport and mobility. We also have to talk about the climate change and how it can impact the housing market and how we build. There are challenges that plans cannot put aside because the plan is not just having a blank page where we just write. We need a full book that has all the functions and doing it slowly because we have to bring these challenges forward in order to be able to actually deal with them. On the other hand, we also have difficulties when it comes to what is institutional and instrumental. How do we build it? How does the municipality manage to structure the juridical part when it comes, and also when the technical part? It becomes a very big challenge to make a plan that actually has a lot of flexibility, which means that making it very flexible can end up putting in crisis the balance. And that kind of balance is very difficult. So when we put rules into this kind of area, that also means that we will have our feet tied. If we don't let of a lot of openings, we'll notice the prerequisites will start getting bigger, which means that sometimes they will not be able to answer those kinds of challenges. So there are things that are not negotiable. We do have to have them. But there is here a necessity for us to be more agile when it comes to growing planning because we do not have time. We have a lot of demand. And since the planning is very long, without having a way of uh, be able to do it, we tend to lose quality and the access that we have to them. If a plan is not adjusted, it can lead to problems and create more challenges. Okay, also, when we talk about the way we create this planning, there's a necessity when we talk about adapting, because we have to simplify this kind of processes. We have a necessity of planning, finding solutions. So the plan of in game manage that will start a public discussion. And I would say that in middle terms, in terms of efficiency, sometimes plans like this, they take very long, up to 10 years being solved. And I think there is a need for more efficiency and more agility when it comes to kind of this kind of planning. So it becomes very necessary that we find ways, that we find a composition in making those things more agile. Because it doesn't interest us to rehabilitate the territory without having a mechanism that allow us, the people who are interested in it, to participate too. This brings us to the necessity of having a more collaborative territory, in a way that this planning actually becomes a very dynamic situation. Many times, this kind of planning is done, but then in the next revision, it is stabilized. The juridical part, which regulates the elaboration of the project, this regime that started in 2015 has a lot of aspects that would potentially be answering the question that I was talking about earlier. On one hand, it has a, a strategical approach that forces to work together in different levels. But this kind of articulation is not always very easy, and it's not taken to the end. Usually, the municipalities have a certain director that does it, but there's other more specific programs that are done by other people in intermunicipality parts, which are imperative in this kind of construction. So we have something that is only on paper, while what's going to be happening in actuality can be changed. That isn't because we don't have enough, That is because we don't actually materialize it in the end. So this has to do with allowing citizens to actually approach and enter these kinds of conversations. And with this, it makes people more proactive. With it being the responsibility of the municipality, it can help with also private needs. But this part is also very important because it allows you to be able to deal with situations such as trying to find balance between public and finding ways to make it more simple when it comes to housing. Other aspects that was clarifying in this process was getting rid of the urbanized space. Because that place was didn't have a correct infrastructure. So it created a impression that it's either rustic or urbane, making us think that the it's only infrastructure if it's in an urban soil. And in a way that we can truly turn the soil into urbane, we'd have to have changes. And only then would be able to have public expansion. But it can also help with aspects and answers. But it can also have different things that make it more difficult. Aspects that have to be worked on because we don't know how to deal with those things yet. So the democratical part is very difficult because it doesn't follow with the current trends. So we have the sectorial part in the norms in relation to the proposals in the territorial part, which make it very difficult. Another aspect that is very important, it's a lack of culture when it comes to construction, which means that, as I said before, when creating territorial areas, the plans many times did not even make it out of the room. So we need that those plans are actually made into reality because if they don't, we stay in a blocked path and we have a lack of responses when it comes to urban part. Because if I could have to transform an urban part, maybe I will not have the correct tools to be able to make them be converted. So we need to complement the plans. But since the country hasn't worked with the logic of we have to make things urbane and we slowly with licenses, with small licenses, and not with areas that are programmed and structuralized. there's a difficulty when it comes to have municipalities and even with privates, with techniques, to find a reactive way of thinking and turn it into a proactive way of thinking. We can't just take only the small part, the part that's isolated. We have to take the planning. And I think that has to do with a lack of culture when it comes to planning. We also have to talk about the instability in the court system. We see that there's a difficulty in this certain area. The last plannings that happened last year that looked for to dealing with the problems had problems that made it so that there would be consequences when going forward, which meant that we had to go back and redo things. Since we have previous difficulties that didn't allow us to follow through. That also didn't help and made people very. So it has to have a lot of efficacy, and we have to find a lot of agility in a way to actually make things work.